Hello everybody and welcome back to another CB Showtunes tutorial. Now today's tutorial we're going to be setting up our bow and being able to fire a projectile. Now keep in mind that since this is a projectile, it's not going to be aiming specifically at the target that you're going to be shooting at, but it's going to be aiming at a near to target situation, mainly because projectiles are very reliable. So what we're going to do today, starting out, is we're going to start off with learning how to set up our weapon controller on our character, or basically setting up our character. And now if you've been following along, it's at the tutorial series from the beginning, from our character controller all the way till now. You'll be caught up with our player, our camera script, and of course a couple others. Now for this specific part, for part 2 of our bow tutorial, what you're going to need to do is you're going to open up your GFX underneath your player. You're going to find your character and you're going to go down to where your skeleton is. From there, you're going to simply open it up to where you could find either your left or right hand, depending on which side you want your weapon to be. I believe mine is going to be on the left hand, so I'm going to open up my left shoulder, left forearm, and open up my left hand. And as you can see, I put an empty game object here called weapon holder. Now this weapon holder you're going to have to adjust to position, because this is where we're going to be instantiating our weapon. So if you have a bow, it's going to instantiate a bow there. If you have a sword, it's going to instantiate the sword there, etc. So you always want to be able to set this up and rotate it properly. So to set it up properly, what you're going to do is you're going to press play and then go back over to scene mode and then simply adjust it once you have your script set up. Okay, but for now we're not going to do that. We're just going to head back up here. Okay, so the next thing that you want to do is of course create a bow. Now this is just a random bow that I created. It's not really anything special. It's just a line, and if we open this up, you're going to see an emitter. This one right here is really just a sphere that I created, and a sphere will be pretty good. All you need is it positioned where you want it to be, and you could push it a little bit forward if you want it, push it a little back if you want it, basically wherever you want it to be. And on this bow, you're going to want to set up the graphics. So the bow itself is just an empty game object, okay? The emitter is a sphere, and then you have the GFX, which is your graphics, and then you could just simply drop your graphics there. Once you have that set up, you're going to make it into a prefab, and then just make sure that you adjust it. Next, what you need to do is create a I guess you could say a projectile of some sort. Now, I was thinking about going with the original bow and arrow concept, but I found a lot of issues whenever setting it up, because the arrow needs its own physical movement system. Because if you shoot the arrow up, it needs to be able to go up for a certain amount of time and then go down, and yeah, it was just a lot more complicated than just creating a normal projectile. And I know that I don't want to make these tutorials too long, so I know there's another tutorial out there specifically regarding arrows, so just go check that one out, and it should help you out a lot. Okay, so this ball is simply a sphere, and it's going to have a sphere collider, going to have a rigid body. We have it set to use gravity. If you take off use gravity, you're going to have a straighter shot. Like if I hit apply now, and simply select my ball and bow. Oops, I accidentally hit caps lock. Select both of those and then disable them and press play. Whenever we spawn, it's going to allow us to fire our bow or fire our projectile, and it's going to be a constant stream like that. So it really just depends on how you want your projectile to fire. So yeah. So that's all we really have on this. Just make sure that you have your rigid body attached to it, and you should be good. So let's go ahead and delete both of those. Alright, so now since we covered how to set up inside of our scene, you want to be able to now head over into Unity or Visual Studios. Now, I believe we created this weapons controller on our previous tutorial. And in fact, we created our weapon, and we also created our weapon activator. Or actually, no, we didn't create our weapon activator. This is for this tutorial. But first things first, we want to go back to our weapon. This is our scriptable object we created to design our weapons. And you want to add two new public variables. So the first one we're going to add is a game object called Projectile. This is the projectile we're going to be shooting. The second one we're going to be using is a projectile force. This allows us to be able to determine how much force is behind our object. If we don't have this force behind the object, it's not going to fire. So if I go over to our weapon object that we created earlier, you're going to notice that I set our projectile to the ball that we just made, and I also set our projectile force to 25. You can adjust these values to whatever you want it to be. Alright, so let's go ahead and create, I'm going to erase that new. Just make sure that you have this inside your weapon script and that you do add those two variables. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is talk about our weapon controller. And underneath our weapon controller, we did add a couple new things as well. So we have a public transform called weapon spawn point, and that is where our weapon holder is, if you see over here inside of Unity. So whenever we set this up, you're going to simply select your player and simply drag and drop into that player, and then simply grab and drop right on top of our weapon spawn point. Okay. Then, of course, we have a game object for weapon to equip. This is going to be the specific weapon we're going to be equipping. Now, since we already created this public weapon called weapon, we don't actually have to have this game object on this specific script. That way, we could just simply call it from our weapon scriptable object instead. So now we're going to also grab the weapon activator called WP, and we'll talk about that once we get to void start. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and erase these new because we just discussed it. And like I said, just make sure that you add these new variables. And the next thing that we want to do is talk about our void start function. Now inside our void start function, we're going to say weapon to equip is equal to instantiate our weapon.prefab. Now make sure that this is inside if weapon is not equal to null. The reason why we have that is because if it is equal to null, we don't want any of this running. Otherwise we'll get some errors and it's just going to be a huge wreck. So just make sure that you have it within that. But anyway, so we're going to be instantiating our weapon prefab, and we're going to be instantiating it to our weapon spawn point, or as a child of our weapon holder right here. And we're also going to be calling it as a game object. That way we can call it again throughout this script. Then we're going to say weapon to equip dot transform dot position is going to be equal to our weapon spawn point dot position. So now we're going to be taking this object and moving it to where this is. And that's why the position of this object right here is very important. So make sure that you do move that around and adjust it to what you need it to be. We also set our weapon, our WP, which was our weapon activator. Now, we haven't discussed this one yet. I will leave that weapon activator inside the comment section below. But we're going to be grabbing the WP, and we're going to say it's equal to our weapon to equip dot get component weapon activator. And if we actually select our prefab and go over to our bow, you're going to notice that we have the weapon activator attached to the empty game object. And like I said, we'll get into that in just a minute. Okay, so let's head back over into Visual Studios. And like I said, we're just going to be grabbing the component. Then we're going to ask a question. We're going to say if our weapon.weapon type is equal to our weapon of weapon type bow. So we're going to be checking to see if our weapon is equal to a bow weapon. If it is, then we're going to be grabbing the projectile inside of our weapon activator, and we're going to be setting that weapon's projectile to this projectile right here underneath our weapon. So if this bow is different from another bow, or this projectile is different from another projectile, you could easily switch it out whenever you want it to be. We also set our projectile force from our weapon activator to this current force of our weapon. That way, if you have a new bow, it can switch it out instead of it using the same force. And that's all that you have there. So like I said, just make sure that you get those there. I just remembered. Okay, yeah. Just make sure that you get those there as well. Okay. Let's go and erase that. And we're going to roll a little bit further down. And this is the last part, which is underneath the void late update, where we set up our chest rotation and look at target for our character. We also need to set the emitter look point, because for our emitter to be able to work properly, we want to be able to constantly be looking at the target that we set up earlier. Otherwise, it just doesn't work out that well. So we're going to grab our weapon activator, .emit point, and we're going to set it to look at our target to look at. So if you remember early on, and I mean way early on, inside of this tutorial, we had set up a target dummy in front of our main camera. Okay, now this target dummy is what we're going to be looking at. So if I actually, here it is actually. So this is what our target is going to constantly be looking at. So whenever we aim with our bow, it's going to automatically look at this point. And you can drag and move it further forward, further backwards, left, right, whatever, to get a straighter shot. And that's how you actually improve your accuracy of your weapon. Okay, so that's all that you have set up there inside of our weapon controls. So just make sure that you make all the changes that we did to that script right there, and you should be good. Just take it slow and easy. Okay, now we're going to head over to our weapon activator. Now this is a brand new script, so if you don't have the script, that's okay. Go over to your scripts folder, and then you're going to right click and then create a C# script, and you're going to make sure that it is called weapon activator. And once you have this weapon activator script set up, you're going to create 3 different public objects. So you're going to have a public transform called emit point. This is going to be on the weapon itself, so that's the reason why we have it set as a prefab. So if I go over to our prefab and drag that back out again, what it does is we want to be able to grab the emit point from a child object. So as long as it's a child and it's not inside the scene itself, then it will save the emit point since this script is going to be going into the prefab. So simply grab your emitter and you're going to drop it right on top of there. The next thing we have is our public game object called Projectile. Now this we don't necessarily have to set up immediately. We could actually just wait for our weapon controller to do it for us. But what I like to do is go ahead and drop in our projectile just to make sure that there are no errors popping up. And that of course would be our ball. So you would go down to your prefab folder and then drop in your ball. So there you go. You now have your projectile set up. Then of course if we head back over here, you're going to see the rotation. So or position and rotation. Nope, not that. You're going to see the public float called projectile force. I am getting so out of line right now. So the projectile force is going to also be set by our weapon controller. So you can go and leave that as 0 if you want, or you can set its value and it still will change. Then we have a public void called attack bow. Now attack bow is going to be called whenever we left click. So if I actually return over here, we might actually have one more thing to set up. Yeah. So right here. Now I know we set this script up, I believe it was last time with our bow. What you want to do is also call your weapon activator and hit attack bow. That way it only activates if you're aiming and if you're able to attack. And then you won't end up with an issue of attacking or shooting a projectile while you're not actually ready to attack. Okay, so here we're going to grab our quaternion. Or create a quaternion. We're gonna call this offset, and then we're going to set our quaternion.euler equal to 0, -80, 0. This allows us to be able to adjust the rotation of our projectile. And I had a little bit of issues trying to get it just right. So, you know, if you're setting up a projectile that has like a stick figure, make sure that you do work on that rotation value because it can have its issues. So, yeah, just a pre-warning and all. Next, we have a game object called proj for projectile, and it's going to be equal to the instantiated projectile. So we're going to be instantiating a new projectile. And we could call this as game object as well. In fact, I'm going to put that there. This is just a safeguard. I don't think we have to do that anymore, but, you know, whatever. Next, we're going to create the proj, or we're going to be grabbing our proj, and we're going to say transform dot position, and we're going to make it equal to emit point dot position. So now we're moving this object that we just instantiated to our emitter point. Then we're going to set its transform dot rotation, so proj transform dot rotation, and we're going to make it equal to our emit point dot rotation. So since our emitter is constantly looking at our game object, so since it's constantly looking at our target dummy, the projectile is going to constantly be shooting towards the target dummy. And then, of course, we're also going to multiply it by offset, so that would be our -80. And then we're going to grab our projectile. We're going to get its component of rigid body. That's why I made it very clear we needed a rigid body on the ball. Then we're going to say .add force. So we're going to be adding a force to this object. Then we're going to say emit point dot forward multiplied by projectile force. So now our bullet or our ball is going to decrease over time if it has gravity affecting it. So it's going to shoot out with the most amount of force and then start dropping off initially. So we're going to multiply that by projectile force and force mode dot impulse. And that's what I was talking about by it's going to decrease gradually. So with impulse, most of the force is going to be up front. It's going to be a sudden force, and then it's going to start dropping off. You also have force, which is a really good one as well, but it's pretty constant. You have velocity change. Those things right there are pretty cool as well. And you could just simply experiment with every single type and determine which one's best. Now keep in mind that impulse will respond the fastest, which means that 25 is pretty good for its distance, but if it's force, you probably want to start out with 500 or something like that. Then, of course, we have the last one, which is destroy our projectile within 5 seconds. Now, this you could take off if your projectile is supposed to hit something, because then you could just simply go into your projectile, set up a destroy on hit, and then, of course, whenever you hit an object, it's going to destroy that object. But for now, we're going to leave that as is. So if we head back over into Unity again, and we go over into our game view, hit play, and of course let it load up, and there we go. We're now able to move around, you know, everything that we did inside our previous tutorial. We're able to aim, we're able to fire, and all that cool stuff, just like that. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out some of my other videos. If you have any questions regarding this video, make sure that you leave that inside the comment section as well, and I'll be happy to answer those as soon as possible. And of course, make sure that if you have something that you want me to add to this tutorial or any other tutorial, that you leave those inside the comment section as well, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. Please leave. Oh yeah. And of course, I hope I see you guys next time.